A few weeks ago, I got a call from a friend of mine, Chuck. Chuck and I have a lot in common. Both of our first names are Charles. His mom calls him Charles, and his friends call him Chuck. My mom calls me Chuck, and my friends call me Charles. We both grew up on the East Coast and went to school there. And from there, we found our way to San Francisco, where we met where our kids went to school. We also both had an imaginary friend named Jim as children, or at least when I was a child. Chuck's Jim may have stayed around longer. I don't know.
So when you said you were going to do this podcast, it didn't really matter what the topic was to me. So I was interested in seeing what you would do with history or not history, as you put it. And somewhere it jarred in the back of my memory from, I don't know, 35, maybe even 45 years ago that I read this book. And the phrase that jumped out at me was Peshtank, because that's what the Indians called the Paxtons in this book. And I was like, what is the book? And I remembered it was Light in the Forest.
The Light in the Forest didn't ring a bell with me, so I looked it up. Wikipedia says, The Light in the Forest is the first novel published in 1953 by U.S. author Conrad Richter. Though it is a work of fiction and primarily features fictional characters, the novel incorporates historical figures and is based on historical fact related to mid-1700s colonial America. Richter was, at one time, a long time ago, highly thought of. Wikipedia continues, his novel The Town, 1950, the last story of his trilogy, The Awakening Land, about the Ohio frontier, won the 1951 Pulitzer Prize for fiction. His novel The Waters of Cronus won the 1961 National Book Award for fiction.
My reading history, I'm not very well read, but I was very impressionable with several books in my childhood. And this was one of those books, this in Light in the Forest. And so I've gone back and read these books to see if they held the same kind of imagination and focus and whatever for me. And in general, they have. I actually remember passages verbatim. And so I went back to this book and I contacted you immediately. I said, I remember this book. And it talked about the Paxtons and Peshtank. I don't remember anything about the Conestoga. I don't recall anything about Lancaster. I don't recall anything about the names that the main character, True Son's father, reels off, who died in the Lancaster jail. I didn't remember any of that.
So at this point, I was like, okay, great. One of the few books Chuck read as a kid and probably is massively outdated and probably very cringy book from the 1950s. A book that, as I was trolling through Wikipedia, I found out that had actually at one time been made into a very cringy live-action film of the same name by Disney in 1955. But then I downloaded a copy of the book from an online archive and was like, wait, I know this.
And immediately when I looked at the book, the cover of the book, just, a rush of memories. It's the exact same cover of the book that I remember, right? It's a stunning cover. It's in the dark, deep forest, and there's this figure that is just white. And he's, the light in the forest or something like that.
I remembered that cover. It was one of those books that there was always 5 or 10 copies hanging around in some middle school teacher's classroom. One of those books that I was probably supposed to read, but never got around to. Sea of Mice and Men. But that cover.
So to me, it was just so interesting that this all tied back to my, impressionable childhood. And it was really a nugget. It was really something that, it was something that really, that there was this definite thing that I can point back to in my childhood, that I was reading the story and how this book made this great impression on me, even though I hadn't thought about it for decades.
So this week, we're going to get a bit meta and look at how we come to know what we think we know about this story and what role does memory play. And how has this legacy been shaped by people with a wide range of intentions? Because the story of the Paxtons and the Conestoga is just that. It's a story, a narrative. And as we've seen in the previous episodes, it's a story that was widely distributed and manipulated in its time. But that tradition of interpreting and appropriating the story of the Conestoga and the Paxtons and the impact and resonance of that story and that time and place didn't end in the 18th century or even the 20th century. It's part of our culture right up until today. I'm Charles Stewart, and welcome to Episode 20, Gandestoga and Modern Memory. At some point when I was in college, I sat in on a seminar by a guy named Paul Fussell. Fussell was a professor of English, but he had also been a soldier in Europe during World War II and had written of the horror, dishonesty, and futility of his wartime experience in a book called Wartime. The title of one chapter, Chicken Shit and Anatomy, tells you all you need to know about this experience and how it shaped his worldview and the worldview of a generation of others. A deep mistrust of institutions and the petty bureaucracy and doublespeak language that compels humans to do massively inhumane things. Looking at this war and the writing that comes out of it tells you about how societies think about war and its relations to it. The deeply satiric, deep distrust of authority permeates most of the best post-Second World War literature. In the same way, you can't imagine anyone publishing or writing a book like Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, his memoir of experiences during the bombing of Dresden before the war. You also can't imagine anyone after 1950 reading Rudyard Kipling's Tales of the Heyday of the British Raj as anything other than, at best, an anachronism. Fussell wrote another book of criticism earlier in his career called The Great War in Modern Memory. In it, he charted a similar effect on the post-First World War generation of writers and their worldviews. Sir Alfred Lord Tennyson, writing from the vantage of Victorian London, wrote in 1858 of what he and his generation saw as the gloriously heroic, if massively futile, charge of the Light Brigade during the Crimean War. He wrote, "When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made! All the world wondered. Honor the charge they made. Honor the Light Brigade. Noble 600. From the perspective of the trenches in the First World War, soldier-poet Wilfred Owens also wrote about a later generation of British men going to battle in his Anthem for a Doomed Youth. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries for them now, no prayers nor bells." Owens didn't see nobility in war, no glory, only carnage. Wilson was killed in the same war in 1918. In 1858, war was a heroic instrument of the noble empire. In 1918, horrific slaughter. And in 1960, so absurd that only scatology and black humor could attempt to describe it. So, if you want to know how a society thinks about war, or even itself in relation to itself, look at how it reflects on violence and conflict and that generation's relationship and role. So what I'd like to do this week is a similar thing, and look at how over the generations, the violence inflicted on the Conestoga by the Paxtons, in the context of a larger conflict, the French and Indian War and later Pontiac's Uprising, has been thought about and written about over generations, and how has this changed, and why? The lens, while focusing on the Conestoga massacres, will be a little broader and will incorporate the cultural space of the Conestoga Susquehannock, that in a previous episode, with the help of Matthew Kruer, we identified as Gandestoga. So how has this been interpreted by white settlers, the American historians, as well as Native American writers and artists across the generations? And then today, when that same story is being interpreted not through the lens of my people looking west into Indian country, but from the perspective of looking east from Indian country. And in the case of that remarkable little book that Chuck told me about, both perspectives at the same time. And to get meta again, what is the story of this story? What purpose does it serve in retelling? And why and how do succeeding generations keep coming to this story?
I'm not from Lancaster. I'm not even from Pennsylvania. I was doing my graduate work, my PhD at Fordham University in New York. And I was really interested as a literary scholar in this sort of conflation that happens in the fiction of Charles Brockden Brown. He was this writer that was working right at the end of the 18th century. And he is somebody who grew up in Philadelphia.
This is Will Fenton, the creator of Digital Paxton.
And in his fiction, there's this constant recurrence of Quakers and Indians and a conflation that starts to happen across his fiction. I said, oh, that's curious. That's really interesting. And so I was privileged to get some research funding to come down to Philadelphia and to do some work in archives, because I was really interested in really getting back to the archival materials that could help me sort of explicate this. And I just became utterly transfixed by the materials at the Library Company of Philadelphia and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania that were related to the Paxton Massacre, 1763. There was a pamphlet war through which both critics of the Paxton vigilantes and apologists for them had this wide-ranging debate that really consumed Philadelphia in 1764 and would have been readily available to Philadelphians like Charles Brockden Brown. And so my interest was really in that print culture. And the deeper I got into it, the more I got interested in all the other material that was circulating at the time, including broadsheets and political cartoons and diaries and treaty minutes and letters. And that sort of continued to sort of open up the aperture as I spent more and more time working on this project.
And if you remember from the episode on the pamphlet war, writing about the Conestoga, in air quotes, was not always about writing about the Conestoga people at all. They were often just a framing device, a proxy, often appropriated to serve some other strategic, read usually political, objective. So it starts out with people like Franklin speaking directly to the essence of the matter as he saw it, murder and mayhem. The Conestoga and Paxton, in other hands, becomes shorthand for political malfeasance. Will Fenton.
But, shortly after that first wave of pamphlets, there's a bunch of pamphlets that immediately turn on the Quakers and the Quakers in the assembly and the Quakers that they see as aligned with both the proprietors and the Paxton critics. And so it's really, these are warring times. What are peaceable people like the Quakers doing governing us? They're not fit to govern in these warring times. And others said, well, they're actually not that peaceable. Some of them took up arms and joined that militia to fight off the Paxtons in Germantown. So it turns out their peace testimony, it's sort of conditional, they're happy to take up arms for their native friends. They're just not in it for their fellow white settlers. So those kinds of arguments start to gain some traction. And then, it really isn't until, I'd say, that March that you start getting a strong emerging Paxton defense, which is simultaneously a critique of the Quakers, but also a critique of the Conestoga people saying they're not so innocent. They actually were involved in various ways in the 7 Years' War, which is a dubious claim. And that, really until all Indians are expunged from the colony of Pennsylvania, there can't be safety and security in the colony. And that really takes you to the last thread of the debate, which really becomes about law and order. It moves away from the particulars of Indian violence or the conduct of the Paxton men, and it shifts to one about governance and the question of royalization, whether or not the proprietors are capable of safeguarding the colony or whether the crown needs to step in. And that becomes a big mess that splits up all the different factions
Napoleon Bonaparte said, supposedly, that history is a set of lies agreed on. Winston Churchill said of it, "I know history will be kind to me because I'll write it." Why not? So hearing that, how do we know what we come to know about what we think we call history? In the case of historian Redmond Cunningham and his writing on the Conestoga, the answer's easy. He made it up as he went along. This is journalist and actual historian Jack Brubaker, reading from his book, Massacre of the Conestoga.
Redmond Cunningham spent the spring and summer of his 62nd year diligently distorting the story of the Gandestoga massacre. He tampered with evidence, he fabricated documents, he boldly lied. And he designed an 1843 series of newspaper articles in the Lancaster Intelligencer and Journal to persuade readers that earlier accounts had misrepresented the Paxton Rangers. He achieved a major bonus by successfully hoodwinking generations of historians.
And we're not talking about garden variety historical misrepresentation like cherry-picking sources to fit the narrative. No, Redmond was unique. He literally created the sources, forged documents to establish his narrative.
Before Redmond Cunningham, many historians, most historians, said that the Conestoga massacre was a horrible thing and that certain people in Lancaster had enabled the killers. The conspiracy idea was forefront among Quakers and Moravians in particular. But at least in the written record, there doesn't seem to be much doubt. The literate people in Lancaster thought that this whole massacre had been fixed by other people than just the killers. And then in 1843, Redmond Cunningham, a local lawyer and an amateur historian who had somehow gained a following among real historians in Philadelphia and Lancaster, got a lot of space in the Lancaster paper. He wrote 15 articles about Indian history in general, and then about the Conestoga massacre in particular. And in those 15 articles, he managed to entirely change the story into one of exoneration for the Paxton Rangers and an implication of utter guilt for the Conestoga Indians.
This isn't historical revision. He reinvented it.
The real problem was he fabricated letters and parts of the story, and certain elements of the letters they supposedly wrote have stuck in the record, and historians who haven't taken the time to go back to the original documents have repeated those lies right up until recent decades, when a new group of historians has gone back to the original record and not simply parroted what Redmond Cunningham began in 1843. He warped the record from 1843 until late in the 20th century.
So the big question is, why? Why go to all this trouble? This didn't happen in a vacuum. Who sought to gain? It was around this time that descendants of the Conestoga, led by Peter Dockstader, a second-generation Conestoga living with the Oneida in New York, filed land claims seeking the return of the property in Manor Township that had been set aside for his ancestors by William Penn. In 1845, records show that he traveled to Lancaster, requesting to have the 5,300 acres in Manor Township, Conestoga Town, returned to the descendants of the Conestoga Susquehannock, a tribe of which he claimed to be a member, and a topic we'll explore in more detail in our next episode. While no records or correspondence survive, it's fair to assume that Dockstader and others were making inquiries from New York to the city and county of Lancaster prior to his trip, looking for documents and information that could support his claim, and that Cunningham and other members of the Lancaster elite got wind of this and were, understandably, alarmed. 5,000 acres of prime Pennsylvania farmland is now, and was then, a lot. And it's not hard to imagine Cunningham and friends, maybe clients, sitting in Lancaster's posh Hamilton Club across from the courthouse, saying that, maybe someone should do something. And while there's no proof of any causality, and the only correlation was that Cunningham was a lawyer in and about the time that these claims and subsequent court actions occurred. But in looking for a motivation as to why he would go so far out of his way, not just to lie and slander, but to actually forge documents, alter the historical record, it's not hard to see that he lived in an era and a community where any issues of native claims, let alone claims of sovereignty, were seen as things that belonged in the past and needed to stay there for solid financial reasons that benefited the landed class in Pennsylvania. In Conrad Richter's time, the early and mid-20th century, America's collective memory of the Conestoga and other Indians had moved from the lived experience in the time of the pamphlet wars to a distant historiographic myth, a received dream that could be used as parable. But in Richter's case, and to his credit, he didn't lazily latch onto the standard tropes of his time. The first myth-making held westward expansion as destiny, foregrounded by Indians as bloodthirsty obstacles to be overcome. The second characters them as natural history, part of a vanishing wilderness, gone along with the bison and the carrier pigeon. I'm reminded of the diorama in the American Museum of Natural History in New York of Dutch meeting with Lenape Indians emerging from an autumnal oak forest, as if they were part of it. But are they emerging from the forest or receding? Both, of course. James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, an 18th century ode to a vanishing wilderness, clearly places indigenous people as part of this wilderness. Writing in 1826, the novel concludes with the narrator, a Native American, witnessing his people fading away into the woods in the last light of the day and at the end of an age. "It is enough," he said. "Go, children of the Lenape. The palefaces are masters of the earth, and the time of the red men has not yet come again. My day has been long. In the morning I saw the sons of Unimus happy and strong, and yet, before the night has come, I have lived to see the last warrior of the wise race of the Mohicans." So about 125 years later, Conrad Richter wrote The Light in the Forest. And I have to admit, I came to it with pretty low expectations, even with my friends' fond memories. Given how most non-white, non-Europeans were portrayed in mainstream media at the time, I was on firm ground. I was expecting a heavy helping of Daniel Boone blazing trails across the frontier, and I had my bias confirmed when I discovered that the 1958 Disney film version of the novel stars Fess Parker, who later became Daniel Boone in the TV series of the same name that ran from 1964 to 1971. So, given all I just said, I expected to engage with this book as a historical artifact. And yet, what I didn't expect was that it was, and still is, good. Richter's writing, if not Hemingway, clearly has the chops to win him a Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and a National Book Award. Clean, but evocative. Non-sentimental, but deeply moving. The history, retelling the events of the Paxton community and their effects on the Conestoga, is surprisingly good and unsparing. Even more surprising is that while the book is located in a historical setting, it's not a historical novel. It's not about events. It's about people and their struggle for identity in a fragmented, divided, multicultural world. The story involves a young settler, teenager, who was captured by the Lenni Lenape as a small child and then assimilated into the tribe. The book opens with this by now fully grown Lenape young man being returned to the English as part of an exchange of captives at the end of the French and Indian War in 1764. The English soldiers take him back to his home, Paxton, that he has no memory of, and a name, John Butler, that's alien to him. The book follows his struggles as he's forced by the white community in Paxton to assimilate and reconcile these two irreconcilable identities. Reading it now, I can see why my classmates then and my friends now were drawn to the story.
First of all, I want to thank you for, uncovering that memory for me. And it was just really wonderful to read it again. It's really interesting. I have this impression that I read it in middle school, but I might have read it in high school. And so again, all of these memories start coming back. But to be honest, I can't remember whether or not I read Light in the Forest in high school or in middle school, but it was, I was fairly impressionable at the time. Yeah. So that's interesting because I guess one of the reasons why the topic sort of indirectly affected me was because here I am, an Asian American kid growing up on the East Coast, where my experience was in the 70s and 80s. Growing up on the East Coast was very different from Asian Americans today anywhere in the United States, and especially those who lived in California. So I felt this kind of connection to being an outsider. I mean, clearly his is way, the protagonist is way different, being, jerked away from a culture, assimilating into a culture, and then being shoved back into another culture. But the kind of conflict that he feels, and especially that last scene where, he's supposed to be participating in an ambush and he sees a child that looks like his younger brother and he sabotages the ambush. Right. There's those kind of interesting conflicts growing up as a stranger in a strange land. Right. Always never feeling like you're really part of the culture. So I think that's a reason why this book particularly resonated with me when I was a child. And you mentioned in your podcast several times that it's a story that's been buried. It's in a kid's book, right? It's buried in a kid's book. It's really interesting that this topic has been shed on it in a children's book, right? So and a violent one at that, right? And it's the author is amazing, right? He doesn't hold back, right? He talks about hands and feet getting cut off, right? And it was interesting because when I read it as a child, it didn't traumatize me or anything like that, because it just made sense, right? The Paxtons were just pretty evil people, and that's not to say some of the Native Americans were either, but here it was in black and white, right? So that was really interesting.
What I found even more surprising, again, given where and when it was written and by whom, Richter grew up in central Pennsylvania, by the way, is that how unflinching the history is about the violence inherent in the time and place, the frontier, when members of that community had just recently returned from massacring the Conestoga and marching on Philadelphia. Richter describes a scene where the Reverend John Elder, who, as you recall from previous episodes, was known as the fighting pastor, whose rifle once hung in the Paxton Presbyterian Church, and true son John Butler's uncles, who had recently been to Conestoga town.
True son felt his hackles rise. Suddenly, a translator was too slow for him. He spoke to Uncle Wills direct in English as best he could. "Uncle, you talk of being Christian, but you murdered the Conestoga." The heavy face flared. "So you were lying to us when you said you couldn't talk English." "I no lie. I say nothing." "No, but you tried to deceive us just the same, keeping quiet and making believe you didn't understand. That's an Indian trick, and that's why the Conestoga got their just desserts at last. They pretended they were Christians so they could murder white people without being suspected or caught. If you tried to arrest them and put them on trial like anyone else, the Quakers took them to Philadelphia. They were a poor pagan Christian there." "Rubbish! They are no more Christians than wolves." "I don't know," True Son said, "but they were people. Some good people, some bad, maybe. But you were Christians. You had 40, 50 men. You had horses, knives, tomahawks, and rifles. You blow heads off of Indian men. You kill Indian women and young ones. No one is left. You scalp, you chop, you cut the hands off, you try to cut off feet. Uncle Will's face was distorted. He got halfway to his feet. Yes, and that's the best thing that could have happened to them. They got what they deserved. We fixed the men so they wouldn't butcher any more of our people. We fixed the squaws and the young ones so they wouldn't breed any more murderers. The boy closed his lips tightly. Uncle Wills threw an angry, meaning glance at his brother-in-law. All I have to say, Harry, is you better watch him. If he goes around siding up against his own kin and neighbors, he's liable to get hurt. For the first time since his initial greeting, the other uncle spoke. My boy, I want to tell you something. I'd hate to see you get the wrong impression of your family, especially your father, Uncle Wilson, and other Paxton men. In private life, we're decent and respected citizens. We're member of Colonel Elder's church and subscribe to public benefits. Nobody can tell us about Indians, but we've had too much experience. If a white man kills an Indian, he's a murderer. He daren't be tried where he'd surely be acquitted. No, he has to be taken to Philadelphia where he's convicted and hanged. But if an Indian kills a white man, he's just a poor pagan who doesn't know any better. He daren't be tried either or he'd surely be convicted and hanged. So he's taken to Bucks County or Philadelphia where he's petted and sheltered and made a fuss and never goes to trial. That's the way it is between us and Indians, and why we've all had to take the law into our own hands.
And, spoiler alert, Uncle Wills is satisfyingly killed in self-defense by one of True Son's Lenape cousins. This novel of cultural conflict doesn't end with a protagonist fading nobly into the wilderness and legend. It concludes with True Son facing east from Indian country towards a culture and identity that he despises, but after he is expelled from the Lenape, represents the only path he can take.
The boy stood there for a long time. He knew his father was waiting for him to go. At last, he made the first movement, but at the edge of the water he turned. He hoped he would see his father, the faintest sign of relenting, but he found only a fixed purpose in those dark eyes. My father, do we say goodbye to each other now? Enemies do not do so, Kailogo told him harshly. I am no longer your father, nor you my son. Then who is my father? The boy cried in despair, and turned quickly to hide the blinding wetness in his eyes. There was no reply from behind him. After a moment, he forced himself into the water. It came to him then that this was the second time he was made to go through this living death. Then Half Arrow and Little Crane had waited faithfully on the bank while he crossed. So long as his trail ran by the water, he had seen them still standing on the afternoon side, raising their hands to him in loyalty and affection. But today, he came to the morning side and turned, and no one was watching him from the distant shore. His father was gone. He stood alone in the forest by the river. Ahead of him ran the rutted road of the whites. It led, he knew, to where men of their own volitions constrained themselves with heavy clothing like a harness, where men chose to be slaves to their own and others' property, and followed empty and desolate lives far from the wild, beloved freedom of the Indian.
As the story of the Paxtons moves into the 21st century, it's the idea of origin and identity that begins to move to the forefront. This idea of cultural mobility and transformation becomes another framing device and another window into the story of the Conestoga and their executioners.
I came to this story out of an interest in Irish migration history and an interest in the history of Pennsylvania. So I had earlier written a Pennsylvania history about the Molly Maguires in the anthracite region in the northeast portion of the state. And after in that book, I was looking at how traditions of social protest crossed the Atlantic. So how certain patterns of violent protest that I was familiar with in the Irish countryside played out in Pennsylvania in the era of the American Civil War and Reconstruction in the 1860s and 1870s. And after I finished that book, I actually thought about doing what you might call a prehistory of episodes of social protest of that kind. I was aware, for example, of the regulators in North Carolina and South Carolina and the whiskey rebels in Pennsylvania in the 1790s and the Paxton boys. And I began to wonder, could I write a book about all of them, in which I looked also at what was going on in Ireland and what was going on this side of the Atlantic. And I investigated that for a while, and I became very interested in one of those episodes, and that was the case of the Paxton boys and the massacre of the Conestoga Indians in 1763. So I decided to write just on that topic and to extend the history backwards all the way into the late 17th century and the foundation of Pennsylvania. Well, firstly, as somebody who had approached this topic with the Irish background in mind, what I discovered is it's actually a very American story. The Irish background is less important here than I had initially suspected, because most of the people involved are American-born. They're not immigrants. They're not migrants directly from the north of Ireland and Ulster, but they are from that background. So what I discovered in the Paxton Boys was a very American story in which the old world background kind of receded in significance. It's still very important, but this was a story that unfolded especially in the context of something called the French and Indian War in the middle of the 18th century. The violence, of course, is shocking, unless you're familiar with the tragic history of interaction between people of European origin and the indigenous populations. The more familiar you become with that in American history, the less shocking it is. I start with the massacre in 1763, one of the most notorious episodes in Native American history, in all of that history, and one of the most terrible massacres of the 18th century. So I start there, and then I take the reader back all the way to the 1690s and to the foundation of Pennsylvania with William Penn. And then, if you like, the action rises for the first 2/3 of the book up to the massacre again in 1763, and then I have an extended epilogue where I look at the consequences of that event as they play out eventually in the American Revolution. So the challenge of telling that as a story, and I think it's something that historians can do well, is to embed their analysis in a story, unpleasant, shocking, but a story, I think, that engages us in our attempt to understand the past and the present of this country.
But what if you wanted to tell the story not as a story, but something else, a non-story? Marshall McLuhan was a public intellectual when all things were the rage in the 1960s, and he was famous for coining the phrase, "The medium is the message." Very groovy. I never really understood what he meant by that, and I suspect he really didn't either. But if the story of the Paxtons and the Conestoga was ever about a medium and a message, it was in the 1740s, with the reach and response of new media, the pamphlets, and the story about the back and forth between the dialogue of the pamphleteer and its audience. But in the 21st century, with the omniscience and ubiquity of databases and ready access to all data everywhere, all the time, there is really no dialogue. Out of a mass of digitized online libraries, for better or worse, there is no hierarchy or dialogue or story made for you. You get to make your own story. So enter digital Paxton, where the medium is the story and becomes everything, everywhere, all at once.
So first, in terms of the sort of origin story of digital Paxton, I wanted to show my work. I was working on my dissertation. I had this chapter. So it wasn't even my whole dissertation. It was a chapter of my dissertation on Brockton Brown. And I was making some strong claims about how this pamphlet would have sort of shaped the way that he thought about the colony and about the relationship between Quakers and the other colonists, and both of those relationships with Native peoples in the colony of Pennsylvania, to move beyond this sort of mythology of Penn's peaceable kingdom, which obviously was flawed. So I wanted to make those materials available because I recognized that they were really important to my argument. And I also recognized in sort of the tradition of editorship, which used to be a highly practiced form of a dissertation, that lots of other folks could bring their own insights to these materials. And I wanted to make them more readily accessible. Fortunately, I found really wonderful partners at both the Library Company of Philadelphia and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So we had to set up for like a 10-year plan for this repository to ensure that once you get it out there, it remains accessible in a way that's straightforward and user-centric. And then, really to think about how that repository could grow over time as other materials came into play. So that project started with those two founding partners, and it's grown over 5 years now to include some 24 libraries, archives, cultural heritage institutions, which is great. And at first it was really just a digital collection, but it's since really grown into a full-fledged digital edition. So it has contextual materials that really help you to navigate all of that wonderful material inside the repository. In terms of my own sort of interest, again, I started with this sort of laser focus on the print culture. But the more I worked with the actual archival materials, the more I got interested in both the visual culture. So there are lots of engravings nested within the pamphlets. And then there are also political cartoons that were really bundled with or meant to be read alongside those pamphlets. And they're really interesting because there frankly weren't that many engravers and political cartoonists in early America. So this is a real explosion of material, political cartoons and engravings that I found and identified and made available through Digital Paxton. But I think that they're all really interesting and often very difficult in sort of their historiography that's happening in them. And so I found that visual culture really exciting. And then the other area that really sort of sparked my interest and sort of brought me into a sort of afterlife of this project with the Ghost River project was the manuscript material, which I found really helped me to put myself in the mind of settlers that didn't live in Philadelphia. Because again, what is the print culture? What are the pamphlets and broadsides and political cartoons doing? They're giving voice to folks that had access to printers in Philadelphia and to a lesser extent, Lancaster. But then there are lots of folks living out in the margins of these cosmopolitan spaces that are writing a lot about it, but they don't have access to printers. They're writing letters and they're writing diaries. And those give you a sense of how people outside of those cosmopolitan spaces, people who didn't have access to printers, are responding to it. And that's really critical for understanding the borderland settlers like the Paxtons and Moravians that might have lived up in Germantown. But it's also crucially really important for helping to tell the story of the native peoples of Pennsylvania, who for the most part are not represented in this debate. I think Digital Paxton has 1 or 2 letters from the Conestoga leaders represented in there. But there are lots of other records that sort of give insights into their experience. There's a diary that was kept by someone who grew up on Conestoga Manor. And she, grew up playing with kids on Conestoga Indian Town. And that diary is really exciting because it gives you a sense of how integrated this community was with nearby settlers. And they're really rich records of the native experience in and around Philadelphia. So, those kinds of records I think are really important because they give you a sense of the texture of day-to-day life. It's not just about a political document, which is what so many of these pamphlets are. They're trying to make a political case, and it's all unfolding in the context of an election year where there are lots of people vying for political representation. But there's this other quieter, subtler story that's happening in those manuscript materials that we really sought to mine and to use in interesting ways with the Ghost River Project. This quickly pivots from a debate about the conduct of the Paxton men, their attack on Conestoga Indian town at Lancaster, to a larger political debate. And the native peoples, whether they're the Conestoga or the Lenape who are interned in Philadelphia for that year, they get lost in that debate. They practically disappear. And so my interest was in really thinking about how we could use the materials that we had collected from a lot of different small regional archives, and to really try to tell a story that centered the native people in this story. And to do that, we really have to move beyond sort of a traditional piece of scholarship and to think more broadly about how creative work could allow us to recuperate that presence. And how, at the same time, that creative work could also open the door to getting this story out to new audiences.
So, missing, eliminated, except for a few dictated letters by the Conestoga themselves and diaries written by white settlers, is the story and the voice of Native Americans themselves. Lost, but not forever. Enter Ghost River.
And so that was sort of the germ of Ghost River with my colleagues at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And they were really generous in their funding and their support and their insights into how we could craft a plan to make a graphic novel that would retell this story. But it wouldn't just be a graphic novel. It would also include a teacher seminar with public school teachers from all across the country that could read early pages of the book, learn about the Paxton incident as sort of like a case study in settler colonialism, and that they could then bring that back to their classrooms while at the same time giving us feedback that could make the book even more useful as a sort of education tool. I was really lucky because I found amazing partners. One of the first things I did before we embarked on the project was I went out to Indigenous Comic-Con, which was then in its second year out in Albuquerque. And I met with a number of different artists and authors in the Native community. And, that's where I met Weshoyo Albitro, who is the artist behind Ghost River. She's of the Tongva tribe, as well as Lee Francis, who served as the author of the graphic novel and also the publisher in the context of a publishing house he had started called Native Realities Press. And the two of them had great experience working together. They were both really interested in history. They're kind of nerds like me. And they were really eager to learn about Eastern tribes because both of them are coming from a West Coast perspective. So there was a lot for them to learn along the way. Ghost River was something where I knew that I wanted to foreground the Conestoga and the Lenape in this story, but I didn't know what that would look like. I didn't know what that story was going to be. And I knew that I shouldn't be the one to lead that because, frankly, I've got my own blind spots. Okay. You leave me to my own devices, I'm going to wind up talking about pamphlets for 50 pages, so it was important for me to get out of the way.
Back, after nearly 300 years, after books and movies and the internet, back to print, back to cartoons and the language of the masses, and the graphic novel, Ghost River.
But I think simultaneously it was really about, making something that matters to living people. One of the things that we heard when we went out to Lancaster and met with Circle Legacy Center was, this isn't a story of genocide. It's not the end of the Conestoga. The Conestoga, they had already, many of them had moved west. They had intermarried. They have descendants. We're still here, they would say again and again and again. And when you take that charge as a challenge, it really changes the way you think about your work as a scholar, because it's not just about writing a eulogy to a lost tribe. It's about commemorating a story, a difficult story. And at the same time, knowing that you're accountable to living, breathing people. And that raises the stakes of the work, but it also means that it's that much more important because there's a sense of duty to our kin here.
This sense of duty animates much of the work being done not just to preserve the record and the memory of this event, but to expand it. And maybe it's been a sense of duty, or maybe just a sense of responsibility to try to get the story right for me, and my own nagging curiosity and sense that I wasn't seeing the whole picture and needed to, but also so that other people, you, my listener, my extended kin, could get a fuller picture, a better story, and one that does provide some justice to the people who never get a chance to tell their story. And one of the things that's also animated my work in this podcast, while exploring the depths of my own profound ignorance, was to try to also understand the meta of what I know and how I came to know it, and more precisely, how I didn't really know anything about it. How I never got more than a small bit of the story, and what I did get largely came from a roadside wax museum exhibit. Why? Was I just not paying attention? I mean, as I've said more than a few times, I'm actually a guy who studied history in Lancaster and Philadelphia, and at one college that was actually founded by Benjamin Franklin. So how did I not get this? So I wanted to figure that out a little bit. And I pulled out a book just now that was a textbook for a class I took on the history of Philadelphia in Philadelphia. And the book is called Philadelphia, A 300-Year History. It's 842 pages long and will hold a very large door open all by itself. It was edited by a professor of mine, Russell Wagley, who was at the time an esteemed historian of American history. In the index, there are 17 citations for the Reading Railroad, 1 for the Paxton expedition, and it's only 2 paragraphs long and mainly discusses it in the context of Benjamin Franklin raising a militia. Nowhere is mentioned the Conestoga or the Susquehannock. John Wanamaker, a founder of a department store that closed in the 1990s, gets 11 entries. The generic index heading Indians has only 5.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly why Ghost River had to happen. And hopefully there will be even, more sophisticated projects that emerge that, take this and take it 10 steps further, because it's a complicated story and it's an uncomfortable one. And you know what? History, it's not a fairy tale. It's not supposed to make you feel good. It's, it's supposed to help you understand who you are and who your neighbors are. And that requires nuance and a willingness to deal with cognitive dissonance. And that is uncomfortable.
This is Lee Francis, creator and author of Ghost River.
My name is Lee Francis IV. I also go by Dr. Indigenerd, and I am the CEO of a tribe called Geek Media, ATCG Media, and the executive director for Native Realities. So my family is from the Pueblo of Laguna, which is 45 miles west of Albuquerque, New Mexico, on my father's side. We come from the village of Quischi, and that's in our language. It is known as Pewati Village. On my mom's side, just very Americana. So, mixed heritage, native and non-native. And, the work that I do really revolves around sparking the indigenous imagination and, how do we, tell, stories in pop culture and change the narrative of native indigenous peoples in pop culture through comic books, graphic novels, games, toys, and collectibles. When we first set out with this, and I talked with Will about what we wanted to do, is that the stories of the Paxton murderers, the stories of Ben Franklin had already been told. And they've been told a lot, right? I mean, even if not this particular section of it, Franklin has a lot of ink that he himself dedicated to himself, right? Like he's got a lot of writing that's already been there. There had already been several things that had been written about, the Paxton murderers and what they had done. But nobody wrote it from this native perspective. So the first part was just recognizing always the lack of native voices in these spaces, mostly because they were fighting for survival. They didn't have access to printing presses and nobody was producing their stories. We are blessed by the fact that Franklin actually took their names and did this reflection, know their names, say their names type of thing, right? So otherwise we would never have known who these people were. And these people that were murdered or massacred in cold blood. So there's that part that was the meta, is this sort of erasure that native peoples are facing, that we're sort of like, that we're always, sort of the pawns, that we're the proxies for everybody. And even in this, we became the proxies, right? So Franklin was like, you guys are really bad and we don't like you frontiers folks. And look what you did to the natives and our poor natives. And the frontiers folks were like, oh, the natives are terrible. Look at what they've done to us. And it's always about like, not the natives. It's like about us, right? Which is how we write. And I understand that historically, but it's using the native folks as sort of a proxy in these spaces. And if you look at the pamphlets at the time, the broadsides, all the things that were being produced is like, oh, look how the natives are seducing the Quakers, right? Look at all these native women, that are like, showing their wares. Look, they don't have their shirt, their breasts are out in full view and, like things like that. So it's the native folks as props in the American play. So that's one thing that has continued, that started early on and that's continued through modern day. It's, we're starting to, but we didn't have control of the narrative or the media sources or the means of production, et cetera, et cetera. That's one element of this. The other element that I saw, which I found really fascinating, like how are people nudged? And what we know from the historical record is that this mob, this group of murderers, really had this, this sort of like, they're on the frontier, they're being attacked because they're settling in locations and places that they were told not to, which has all sorts of fundamentals into the whole, pieces around the revolution itself. And it was a couple of the town's leaders at Paxton that were like, you know what? You are aggrieved. This is terrible. And who's done this? Those folks right back there, the natives. And we should go to Philadelphia and we should sweep up everybody along the way. And that's what happened, is how do you get, this group of, this mob that decides to come into the Conestoga Township, which is a group of like 20 elderly and kids and women. They're poor. And they're accused of, essentially in the pamphlets, they're accused of being spies and traitors. And they're the ones that are feeding information so that all the frontiersmen are getting killed, their families are getting murdered and whatnot. And what was fascinating was the ways in which we manipulate the media around that, to push us into these spaces, right? It just takes these little nudges. Oh, you're aggrieved. Yeah, you know what? You should do something about that. Oh, who's the problem? These people are the problem. Oh, you know what we should do? And then slowly this anger, this energy, this resentment, this hatred begins to build. And unfortunately, it's taken out more often than not on the innocent in our societies, right? The folks that are defenseless in these positions. And so those echoes are very resonant right now. Our point with Ghost River was essentially that we wanted this, that responsibility, so that this would be an honoring of those folks, but not the last chapter. Which is why we're very intentional about calling about the river and how history continues to flow, and how, the last image, I knew what I wanted for the last image, because I know Washoya's art. And I usually tend to end, I always try to end my books on that native folks are still here, right? There was a moment in history and it was horrific, but we're still all around. So for all the intentions, we were able to survive. And many of us didn't, but the rest of us have an obligation to show the living.
Next week, in the final episode of this series, I finally get around to answering the question, what happened to the people the rivers are named after? And we get to hear the answer to this question from the people the rivers are named after. So join us then. And if you haven't yet taken a look at Digital Paxton, or gotten a copy of Will Achuve's and Lee's amazing book, Ghost River, all I have to say is, why not? You can find links to all this and more in the show notes at itsnothistory.com. I'd like to thank my guests, Jack Brubaker, Will Fenton, Kevin Kenny, Lee Francis, and Chuck Hahn. Thanks for listening.